A full bus carrying a group of college graduates who had just completed their 1 year teaching program in a rural town got involved in a terrible accident on their way back to their respective homes, all because of one single mistake. Here's what happened. In a small town, a group of young graduates lived and worked at the local high school. The group was lively, always laughing and making friends with the townspeople. They often joined in the town's vibrant evening gatherings where stories of old traditions were shared by elders and children played under the fading sunlight. But as they stayed longer, their curiosity grew. One sunny afternoon, as they strolled through the dusty town paths, they came across the mayor's mansion. The sight of the tall gates and carved statues filled them with awe. But something caught their attention, a golden crown displayed inside the mansion. Its shine was like the sun itself, blinding and beautiful. "It's real gold," whispered Liam, the greediest of them all, his eyes glowing with greed. "Do you know how much this could sell for in the city?" Another graduate, Sophia, shook her head. "Don't even think about it. I've heard stories about this town. They say the mayor's crown is protected by charms and spirits. No one who steals it ever survives." The group paused, letting the eerie silence of the town's myths settle in. But Liam laughed, his voice dripping with pride. "Charms, spirits, those are just stories to scare people. This crown is our ticket to wealth." Some of the graduates were tempted, but others were afraid. "We shouldn't touch it," pleaded Mira. "The town respects their traditions. Let's not bring trouble upon ourselves." But Liam had already made up his mind. "If you're too scared, fine, but I'm taking it. And when I'm rich, don't come crying to me." The days passed, and the end of their program drew near. The graduates prepared for their departure with bittersweet goodbyes to the townspeople. On their last day in the town, while everyone else was busy packing, Liam made his move. In the dark of the night, when the stars were asleep and the town was silent, he sneaked into the mansion with two others who couldn't resist the thought of quick money. The crown sat there, gleaming like a treasure in a dream. "It's even more beautiful up close," said one of them, their voice trembling. "Hurry," whispered Liam, snatching the crown and tucking it into a black nylon bag. "Let's get out of here." When they returned, Mira saw the bag in Liam's hand. "You didn't," she gasped. "We did." Liam grinned, his voice full of pride. "And I'm not returning it." "You're making a mistake," Mira warned, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand this town. You don't know what you've done." But Liam shrugged. "Mistake. The only mistake is not taking it sooner." The next morning, the graduates boarded a chartered bus, ready to leave the town. The sky was bright, and the townspeople waved goodbye, their faces filled with smiles. Sophia and a few others prayed for protection at the start of the journey, but Liam and his friends ignored them, laughing and taunting Mira, calling her Miss Serious. Liam sat at the back, his bag tucked beneath his seat, and a smug grin spread across his face. He could already see the riches waiting for him in the city. But as the bus rumbled down the dusty road, the crown's golden glow remained hidden, a silent witness to the greed that had set their fate in motion. The bus rumbled down the bumpy road, carrying the graduates away from the town. The morning sun shone brightly, casting long shadows of the bus on the dry red earth. Laughter and chatter filled the air as the graduates joked about their time in the town. But Liam sat at the back, quiet, his bag tightly clutched under his seat. The crown inside seemed to hum with a strange energy, though only Liam could feel it. Suddenly, the bus jolted and came to a halt with a loud groaning sigh. The engine sputtered and died. "What's happening?" one of the graduates asked, leaning out of the window. "The bus has broken down," the driver muttered, climbing down to check. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he poked around the engine. Hours passed under the hot sun as the driver tinkered, grumbled, and cursed under his breath. Finally, the bus roared back to life. Relieved, the graduates cheered as the journey continued. But soon after, a loud pop shattered their joy. "The tire has burst," the driver announced, his face twisted with frustration. He walked quickly to replace it, muttering prayers under his breath. The graduates were restless, fanning themselves with their hands as the heat bore down on them. A faint tension settled among them, unspoken but palpable. Still, no one noticed Liam's bag or the hidden crown that lay inside, its silent presence casting an unseen shadow over them all. With the tire fixed, the bus was back on the road, but as the miles rolled by, an uneasy silence fell over the group. The wind that once felt warm now carried a chill. Liam glanced around nervously but kept quiet. Then, out of nowhere, the brakes failed. The driver's panicked shouts filled the air as he struggled to control the speeding bus. "Hold on tight," he yelled, but his voice was drowned by the screams of the graduates. The bus swerved wildly before plunging into a deep ditch. The crash was deafening. Dust and debris filled the air, mingled with cries of pain. When the chaos settled, 3 graduates lay lifeless, their dreams and laughter snuffed out like candles in the wind. Others groaned, their bodies bruised and broken. Rescuers arrived quickly, pulling the injured from the wreckage. But as they counted the survivors, one person was missing. Liam. Maybe he was thrown from the bus, one graduate suggested, his voice trembling. Or burned in the fire, another whispered, shuddering. But Liam wasn't dead. He had slipped away from the crash, clutching his bag tightly to his chest. His legs carried him far from the wreckage, his heart pounding with fear and guilt. The golden crown, still hidden in his bag, seemed heavier than ever, as if it knew the blood that had been spilled because of it. And as Liam fled, the shadow of his greed followed him, waiting to strike again. He hurried away from the disaster, his legs moving like the wind, carrying him far from the scene of devastation. After hours of walking, he finally found another bus heading to his city. Relief washed over him as he boarded, clutching his bag tightly to his chest. The new bus rolled along the road smoothly at first. Liam leaned back, thinking of the money he would make from selling the golden crown. But soon the bus began to shake. "Driver, what's happening?" a passenger shouted. The driver slammed the brakes, but the bus wouldn't stop. It veered to the side of the road before jerking to a halt. The passengers tumbled forward, shouting in fear. "It's the brakes," the driver muttered, shaking his head. They failed. The passengers groaned, climbing out of the bus as the driver inspected it. Liam stayed silent, his heart racing. He knew something was wrong, but he refused to let go of the crown. After hours of delay, Liam finally reached home, his bag heavier than ever. As he stepped into the house, his youngest brother, Toby, ran to greet him. "Brother Liam," Toby shouted, his laughter like music. Liam forced a smile. and patted Toby's head. "Go and play, Toby," he said quickly, heading to his room to hide the crown. But misfortune had already crept into the house like a thief in the night. That evening, as Toby bathed, he slipped on the wet floor. His head struck a wooden shelf, and he fell silent. By the time the family found him, it was too late. Toby was gone. The house was filled with wails of sorrow. Liam sat quietly in a corner, his face pale, his hands trembling. He clutched his knees as guilt gnawed at his heart like a rat. As the night deepened, strange cries began to echo through the house. It was not the cries of mourning, but something darker. Ghostly whispers floated through the air, chilling the family to their bones. The wind howled like a wild beast, and the air grew heavy with fear. "What is happening?" Liam's mother whispered, clutching her wrapper tightly around her shoulders. Then the next blow struck. Liam's father, strong and proud like an old oak tree, suddenly fell ill. His body stiffened, and he could no longer move. "It's a stroke. Call the prophet," Liam's mother cried, her voice shaking. The prophet arrived swiftly, his face grim as he examined the father. He carried a staff adorned with small carvings of animals, and a pouch of herbs hung from his waist. The air grew tense as he spoke in a low, steady voice. "Someone has taken what does not belong to them. Until it is returned, this family will know no peace." The family stared at one another, confused, afraid, and terrified. Liam sat frozen, his heart pounding like a drum. The flickering lantern on the table cast long, eerie shadows on the walls. Who? Who took it?" the prophet demanded, his eyes scanning each member of the family. His piercing gaze lingered on Liam, who shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't take anything," Liam lied, his voice barely a whisper. He clenched his fists, his palms slick with sweat. The prophet narrowed his eyes but said nothing more. He sprinkled a handful of powdered herbs into the air, their sharp scent filling the room. "If what was stolen is not returned, this is only the beginning," he warned before leaving the house, his staff tapping rhythmically against the floor. As the family mourned and worried over their father, Liam slipped away to his room. He unwrapped the crown and stared at its golden surface, which gleamed even in the dim light of his small oil lamp. "It's just a crown," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "Tomorrow I'll sell it and use the money to fix everything. It'll all be fine." But deep down, Liam knew the truth. The golden crown was no ordinary treasure, and his greed had unleashed a storm he could no longer control. He glanced at the door, half expecting the prophet to return, but the house was silent except for the faint sound of his mother's sobs from the next room. As the morning sun rose, Liam's heart was heavy, but his greed remained stronger. He wrapped the golden crown in a black cloth and stuffed it into his bag. "Today I'll sell it," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. The crows outside cawed ominously as he stepped out of the house, his family still mourning, and made his way to the market. The road was long and dusty, lined with thorny bushes that seemed to snag at his clothes as he passed. The bag on his back felt heavier with each step, as though the crown was fighting to stay in the village. Liam's breath quickened, and the sound of his footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. Then it began. From the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow dart across the road. He froze and turned, but there was nothing there. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves around him. His steps quickened, but the shadows followed, moving just beyond his vision. Liam, a voice called. It was faint but unmistakable. He stopped dead in his tracks. It was faint but familiar. Turning slowly, he saw a figure in the distance. It was Toby, his little brother. But Toby's eyes were hollow, his face pale, and his voice carried an otherworldly echo. "Return the crown, brother," the ghostly figure whispered, his voice carrying the wind. The trees around him seemed to shudder, their branches creaking ominously. Liam stumbled back, his heart pounding like a drum. He turned and ran, but more ghosts appeared, their faces twisted in sorrow. Some he recognized, others were strangers. Their mournful wails filled the air, growing louder with each step. As he reached the market, Liam thought he was safe, but suddenly, out of nowhere, masquerades burst into sight. Their tall, colorful figures loomed over him, their whips cracking through the air. The crowd parted in confusion, unsure of what they were seeing. "Thief!" they shouted. "Return what you stole!" The first whip struck his back, and Liam screamed. Another lash, and he fell to his knees. He begged, but the masquerades showed no mercy. Their masks glinted in the sunlight, and their chants seemed to shake the ground beneath him. "Please," he cried, "I'll return it." But no one else could see the masquerade. To the townspeople, Liam was thrashing on the ground, screaming and shouting at invisible enemies. "Is he mad?" someone whispered, shielding their child from the strange scene. Liam's voice rose above the noise of the market. "I stole the mayor's crown," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I stole it." The crowd gasped. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs became shouts. He stole from the town mayor. Liam, still being flogged by the unseen masquerades, staggered to the prophet's house. His cries filled the air as the masquerades followed, their whips cracking like thunder. His clothes were torn, and blood seeped from the fresh wounds on his back. Liam burst into the prophet's house, falling to the prophet's house, falling to the floor. The room smelled of herbs and smoke, but to Liam it felt like a sanctuary. "Help me," he cried, clutching his back tightly. "The masquerades won't stop. They're flogging me." The prophet, calm and stern, watched him with sharp eyes. "What did you do, boy?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Liam trembled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I took the mayor's crown. I took the mayor's crown. It's here in my bag." The prophet shook his head, his voice low and grave. "Do you know what you have done? That crown is tied to the spirits of this town. You've brought a curse upon yourself and your family." Liam fell to his knees. "Please," I return it. "Just make them stop." He held out the bag, his hands trembling. The prophet reached for his tools and began a ritual. He muttered chants, waved leaves, and sprinkled powder over Liam. For a moment, the air grew still, and the masquerades disappeared. The faint scent of burning herbs lingered in the air. "You have 3 days," the prophet said, his tone serious. "Return serious. Return the crown to the mayor, or the curse will consume you and your family. This is your only chance." Liam nodded, clutching his bag. But as he stepped outside, the masquerades reappeared. They cracked their whips, and Liam screamed in pain. No bus would stop for him. Drivers thought he was mad. With no choice, Liam began to walk back to the town. Step by painful step, the masquerades flogged him, their voices echoing in his ears. "Return the crown," they chanted. Liam's journey was long and torturous. His legs were weak, his back raw from the lashes, but he pressed on, knowing the crown had to go back to where it belonged, or he would never find peace again. The sun scorched his skin during the day, and the cold wind bit at him at night. For 2 long days, Liam walked. His body was weak, his legs wobbled like sticks, but he kept moving. The path to the town seemed endless, and the crown in his bag felt like it weighed more than the world. The trees along the path seemed to whisper, their leaves rustling unnaturally. As Liam approached the town gates, the air grew heavier. The masquerades, still following him, cracked their whips one last time and disappeared into thin air. Liam stumbled into the town, his clothes torn, his face streaked with tears and sweat. The townspeople were waiting. The mayor stood at the gates of his mansion, surrounded by his elders and guards. The sky above seemed darker, as though the spirits themselves watched from above. They had known he would come back, they always did. The golden crown had a way of calling its thief home. Liam dropped to his knees, his body trembling. He unwrapped the crown and placed it before the mayor. "Forgive me, Your Honor," he sobbed. "I was blinded by greed. I thought I could escape, but I've paid dearly for my foolishness." The mayor looked at Liam, his face calm but stern. "You have brought great sorrow upon yourself and your family," he said. "The spirits do not forgive easily. You have returned the crown, but the price you've paid is heavy." Liam's heart sank as he remembered his youngest brother and his father. Tears streamed down his face as he bowed his head in shame. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of damp earth, as though the land itself mourned with him. The townspeople murmured among themselves. Some were angry, others pitied Liam. But the mayor raised his hand, silencing them. "He has returned what belongs to us. His greed has already punished him more than we ever could." Just as Liam prepared to leave, a messenger arrived, panting and wide-eyed. "Your father has passed," the man said. "He died this morning." Liam's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. His grief was like a storm crashing down on him with no mercy. The townspeople lowered their heads, for even they felt the weight of his loss. Liam left the mansion, his heart heavy with sorrow. Each step away from the town felt like a stone added to the burden he carried. He thought of Toby's laughter, now silenced forever. He thought of his father, strong and proud, now gone because of his foolishness. "I cannot go home," Liam whispered to himself. "What home is there for me now?" He wandered aimlessly until he reached a large river near the town. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Liam stood at the edge, staring at the rippling surface. His mind raced with memories, the joy he had stolen from his family, the lives lost in the bus crash, the fear he had caused in the town. The crown, now back in its rightful place, had taken everything from him. "I have nothing left," he said, his voice barely audible over the gentle rush of the river. Without hesitation, Liam stepped into the water. The river embraced him, pulling him deeper and deeper until he disappeared beneath its surface. The ripples faded, and the water returned to its calm, quiet state. When the townspeople learned of Liam's fate, they shook their heads in sorrow. His story spread far and wide, whispered by old women to their grandchildren, told by fathers to their sons. "Let this be a lesson," they would say. "Greed is a fire that consumes everything. It spares no one, not the thief, not their family, not their future. And so, the tale of Liam and the stolen crown lived on a warning to all who dare to defy the traditions and spirits of the land. The story of Liam and the stolen crown teaches us a powerful lesson. Greed blinds us to the consequences of our actions and often leads to irreparable loss. It reminds us to respect the traditions and beliefs of others, for defying them out of selfishness can bring harm not only to ourselves but also to those we hold dear. True wealth is not measured in gold or possessions, but in the peace and harmony we maintain with our community and the values we uphold. Let this story be a warning to us all. Never let greed overshadow integrity and respect for others. Thank you for watching my channel, and may this lesson inspire you to live with wisdom and kindness. It was 2 weeks to Christmas, and Mr. Thomas's house was full of noise. The television blared Christmas carols. The younger children squealed as they chased each other around, and pots clanged in the kitchen where Ada was busy preparing snacks. The children were running up and down, excited about their trip to the village, not knowing the kind of evil that was waiting for them. This wasn't their first time, though. Every year, they would travel back home for Christmas, and it was the only time they saw their family in the village. The children loved it because the village was full of fresh air, big trees, and cousins to play with. They particularly enjoyed climbing the giant mango tree near their grandmother's house and competing to see who could pick the ripest fruit. Little did they know this year would be different, and in a terrible and tragic way. Mr. Thomas's wife, Ada, was busy packing clothes and cooking snacks for the journey. She always prepared everything days ahead to make sure nothing was forgotten. But there was one thing she always worried about. Mr. Thomas never prayed. "Thomas, please let us pray for just 2 minutes," she said as she folded clothes into a bag. Mr. Thomas waved his hand like he was chasing a fly. "Ada, stop disturbing me. God knows I am traveling. He doesn't need me to remind him to protect us," he said. Laughing, Ada's heart felt heavy. She looked at her husband and shook her head. "Why won't you understand?" she whispered to herself. The children were no better. The older ones had started copying their father. When Ada would kneel down in the morning for prayers, they would grumble and drag their feet, saying, "Mama, why do we have to pray every day? It's boring." Ada didn't stop praying, even when they made faces at her. She always prayed for her family, asking God to protect them. But deep in her heart, she wished Mr. Thomas would join her, even just once. The house was full of laughter and excitement as the children talked about what they would do in the village. Mr. Thomas smiled at their joy, but Ada sat quietly, watching her family. She held her breath and prayed silently. "Lord, keep us safe this Christmas." As the days to Christmas grew closer, the family didn't know that something was waiting for them on the road ahead. Something that would test their faith and change their lives forever. One evening, Mr. Thomas was driving home from work, his mind on the journey ahead. As he turned the corner, he saw an old woman standing by the roadside, waving her hand for help. Her wrapper was tied tightly around her waist, and she carried a small basket in her hand. Mr. Thomas slowed down and stopped beside her. "Mama, where are you going?" he asked, leaning out of the window. "My son," the old woman said, her voice tired. "I'm going down the next street. Can you take me there?" Mr. Thomas nodded. Get in, Mama. The old woman climbed into the car, settling herself quietly on the seat, her hands clutching the small basket tightly, while her tired eyes scanned the interior, as if searching for something familiar. For a while, they drove in silence, the only sound coming from the engine and the faint chirping of crickets outside. Then the old woman cleared her throat. My son, she began softly, I hope you won't be angry with what I'm about to say. Mr. Thomas glanced at her, curious. What is it, Mama? The old woman took a deep breath. This Christmas, you should not travel to your village. And if you must go, you and your family must pray and fast before the journey. There is danger ahead. Her words hung in the air like smoke. Mr. Thomas laughed a loud, hearty laugh that made the old woman's face tighten. Mama, you want me to stop my family from going to the village? This is not the first time I've traveled for Christmas. Nothing will happen, he said, shaking his head. The old woman looked at him, her eyes dark and serious. I've said what I came to say. The rest is up to you, my son. When they reached her destination, Mr. Thomas stopped the car and the old woman got out. She turned to him one last time. Thank you for the ride. Remember my words. Pray and fast if you must go. Mr. Thomas waved her off, smiling. Thank you, Mama. Take care. As he drove away, he thought to himself, why do people like to scare others with these stories? He convinced himself that she was just being superstitious or trying to sound wise. After all, he had made this trip many times before, and nothing had ever happened. But as the car disappeared into the evening, the old woman stood still, watching, her face unreadable. Her words had been spoken, but what lay ahead was no longer in her hands. It was 2 days to Christmas, and the house was buzzing with excitement. Bags were packed and stacked by the door, filled with clothes, gifts, and snacks for the long journey. The children danced around, talking about the village and all the fun they would have with their cousins. Ada, as always, was the calm one. Before they left, she called everyone to the living room. Let's pray before we go, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Thomas frowned. Ada, what is it with you and prayers? We are not going to the moon. It's just the village. Let me go and warm the car, he said, waving her off. Ada sighed and knelt to pray alone with the children. She whispered her usual plea to God, protect us, Lord, and guide my family. Outside, Mr. Thomas got into the driver's seat, turned the ignition key, and waited. But instead of the usual hum of the engine, there was silence. He tried again, and the car coughed weakly, but refused to start. What is this now? Mr. Thomas muttered. He got out, opened the bonnet, and stared at the engine as if it would explain itself. He jiggled a few wires and tried again. Still, the car wouldn't start. Frustrated, he went back inside to tell Ada, the car won't start. I don't know what's wrong with it, he said, scratching his head. Ada looked at him, calm as ever. Maybe God doesn't want us to go, she said softly. Mr. Thomas snapped. Stop saying that. What does God have to do with the car engine? I'll call the mechanic. The mechanic came quickly, his tools clanging as he inspected the car. After a few minutes, he stood up and shook his head. Olga, the engine has knocked. This car isn't going anywhere until it's fixed. Mr. Thomas's mouth fell open. Knocked how I drove this car yesterday, and there was nothing wrong with it, the mechanic shrugged. Sometimes these things just happen, sir. It's beyond me. Ada smiled faintly. God knows why, she said, her voice steady. But Mr. Thomas wouldn't hear it. God knows why. He mimicked sarcastically. So now what, are we just going to stay here and cancel Christmas? Ada said nothing, only watching as her husband paced the room like a restless lion. After a while, Mr. Thomas clapped his hands and said, "We'll go to the park and take a commercial bus. It's not ideal, but we'll still get to the village." Ada frowned. "Maybe we shouldn't go at all," she said gently. "Don't start again, Ada," Mr. Thomas snapped. "I've made up my mind." And with that, the matter was settled. The bags were repacked for the bus, and the children, still excited, prepared for the journey. But Ada's heart was heavy, and she prayed silently, "Lord, take control." However, what Mr. Thomas and his family didn't know was that not everyone was happy with the yearly Christmas visits. Far away in the village, the air was quiet, but Mama Joy's heart was full of noise. She sat outside her mud house, staring at the dusty road, her face twisted with bitterness. Every year, Mr. Thomas and his family arrived like kings, their shiny car drawing all eyes. His wife, Ada, and their children looked so well fed and happy. Meanwhile, her 4 sons could barely afford to return home, and when they did, it was on old bicycles or on foot. Mama Joy clenched her fist. "Why must every Christmas be about Thomas?" she muttered. Her heart boiled with jealousy, and she made up her mind that this year would be different. She called for her closest friend, Mama Grace. "Sister," she said, her voice low, "I cannot take it any more. This year, that boy and his family will not come here to show off their wealth." Mama Grace, whose tongue was sharper than a knife, nodded. "You are right, Joy. It's time you did something about it." Without wasting time, Mama Joy and Mama Grace went deep into the forest, where the village witches lived. The path was dark, with trees bending low, like they were listening. When they reached the witch's hut, a cold wind blew through, making their skin crawl. The leader of the witches, an old woman with a face as wrinkled as a dry leaf, greeted them. "Why have you come?" Her voice echoed like thunder. Mama Joy knelt on the ground, her head bowed. "I need your help. My stepson, Thomas, must not reach this village alive. His success has shamed me and my children for too long." The witches laughed, the cackle sounding like breaking glass. "Is that all?" the leader said, her eyes glowing. "Consider it done." They gathered around a pot bubbling with thick black liquid. One of the witches threw in a piece of cloth. Mama Joy had brought a piece of Thomas's shirt from his last visit. Another added ashes, muttering words that twisted the air. The leader raised her hand, and the room went silent. "They will not reach this village alive," she declared. "A deadly accident awaits them on the road." Mama Joy's heart swelled with dark joy. She envisioned Thomas's car wrecked on the roadside, the villagers gathered around in shock, and her sons finally free from the shadow of his success. She handed over some coins as payment, and the witches laughed as they prepared the final curse. "It is done," the leader said, her voice cold as stone. Mama Joy returned home that night, her face calm but her heart dancing. She could already picture it. Thomas's car smashed, his family gone, and the villagers mourning. Finally, there would be no one to overshadow her sons. Back in the city, early the next morning, Mr. Thomas and his family arrived at the park. The place was busy with travelers, vendors shouting and selling bread, sachet water, and roasted corn. The children clung to their bags, their excitement bubbling as they watched buses being loaded with luggage. Mr. Thomas, holding the tickets, led his family to a bus. It wasn't as comfortable as their car, but it wasn't as comfortable as their car, but it would get them to the village. As they settled into their seats, Ada's voice broke the chatter. "Please let us pray before the journey begins," she said, standing up and looking at the passengers. Some people nodded and closed their eyes, while others ignored her, whispering to themselves. Mr. Thomas's face turned red with embarrassment. "Ada, sit down," he hissed. "You're embarrassing me. This is public transport, not church." But Ada didn't listen. She closed her eyes, her voice firm and steady. "Lord, protect us on this journey. Cover this bus and everyone inside it. Amen, amen." Some passengers mumbled, while others rolled their eyes. Mr. Thomas shook his head, muttering, "She will never change." The bus soon roared to life and took off, the city gradually fading into the distance. Rows of roadside stalls selling colorful fruits and vegetables gave way to open fields dotted with palm trees swaying gently in the breeze. The children chattered and laughed, pointing out sights along the road. Mr. Thomas, feeling the gentle sway of the bus, dozed off, his head resting against the window. For a while, everything was peaceful. The road stretched ahead, and the hum of the engine filled the air. But as they approached the middle of their journey, things changed. Suddenly, the driver's voice cut through the calm. The brakes are not working," he shouted, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Panic erupted in the bus. Passengers screamed as the bus began to swerve uncontrollably, veering from one side of the road to the other. Ada held her children close, her lips moving in silent prayer. Ahead, a tanker truck loomed, its massive size filling the road. The driver struggled to control the bus, but it was no use. The bus raced toward the tanker, the sound of screeching tires and terrified screams filling the air. In those moments, time seemed to slow. Ada's voice rose above the chaos, crying out, "Lord, save us!" And then, with a deafening crash, the bus collided with the tanker. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and the world went silent. Far away in the village, the wind carried the news of the accident, whispering it into waiting ears. But what no one knew yet was who had survived. News of the accident traveled fast, like wildfire blown by the wind. It reached Mr. Thomas's village before the sun set. People gathered in small groups, murmuring and shaking their heads. "Did you hear Thomas and his family were in a terrible accident?" Mama Joy heard the news too. She fell to the ground, wailing loudly, her wrapper flying as she beat her chest. "Oh, my son, my stepchildren! Wow, my son, my stepchildren! What have we done to deserve this?" she cried, her voice. But deep inside her, a wicked joy danced. She thought her plan had worked. "Now no one will come and overshadow my sons." She told herself, her tears nothing but a mask. At the crash site, help finally arrived. Among the wreckage, Ada and her children were found, shaken but untouched. Not a single bruise or scratch marked their skin. It was as if an invisible hand had shielded them from harm. Mr. Thomas, however, was not so lucky. He had been sitting in the front seat, and the force of the collision had crushed his legs. He was alive, but his legs were gone. The rescuers rushed him to the hospital, his family following close behind, their hearts heavy